Hi everybody, today we're going to go over how we get the dress to move in Shakawa 3. This is a good one to go over because it's a good basis for the head turn and understanding how to make things turn in 360. So in order to make the tutorial easier to understand, I'm going to focus just on the dress. And so we will get rid of some of these layers, but also we're going to get rid of some of the animations so that you can easily understand just the dress turning itself. So the first thing that we want to note is as I drag the timeline cursor around, that Shakawa moves in from the right and actually changes its size a little bit, and the camera is moving a little bit. So we want to get rid of that part so we can focus on the dress turning. But to show you how that part is done, notice that I have the all layer selected. And when I have the all layer selected, we see the keyframes that are associated with that. The top one is the layer ordering changing. And then right here we have the translation layer. And so these keyframes we can get rid of because those keyframes are the thing that's actually moving Shakawa in. And you can see when I go in here and I delete those, now you'll notice that Shakawa doesn't move from the right to left. Now notice that there's this zoom in, and that's this camera. So we don't really need the camera zoom in order to understand the movement of the dress. So I'm going to delete those keyframes. And so now what you have is Shakawa just turning around, so that we can focus on the dress. Now, if you've downloaded this file and you're kind of following along with me or practicing or playing with it a little bit, I would definitely suggest that you keep a copy of the original file stored away and only play around with a separate copy. Now, to focus on the dress, we don't need the stars, the hand, the shade, or any of these other layers. We only need this bone layer all underneath the group layer all. Okay, so as you expand this bone layer all, we don't need the head, of course, or layer 14, or many of these things. The layers that we need are layer 8, that's the dress layer, and layer 4, which is her little bow in the back here. So here I've gotten rid of all the other layers and just made a little bit of naming difference, and you can see this layer 8 is the dress, and that contains two other layers, the polka dots and the dress itself, and then layer 4 is the back bow. And notice that as we do this, we do have the back bow and the dress layer switching, and if I close this dress layer here, you'll see that they switch. So that's really what's happening. So, and you can see that in the animation, that the bow goes behind and in front of the dress. Okay, so now that we've looked at the basic organization of the layers and identified the ones that really apply to the dress, let me zoom out a little bit, and I'm going to turn on the bones. I'm actually not going to worry about the bones. I'm going to show you the actions instead. If you're not familiar, these are smart bones, smart bone dials actually, and I'm not going to go into that too much detail, so if you need to know more about that, you can look at some other tutorials on smart bone dials, but that's what these are. And every smart bone dial is associated with an action. So let me bring up the actions under window actions. Now, all of the bones are sitting over here, and for the smart bones, you can see that they are associated with actions, and the actions that are important are highlighted as you select a layer. So for example, if I click on the dress layer, that's how I know that it's the BD turn and BD face actions and smart bones that really affect the dress, because the other ones aren't highlighted, so they don't really have an effect on the dress. The same thing for the polka dots, and then the same thing for the back bow, so that we know that these are the only bones that really affect that. Now, I'm not going to go ahead and delete all the other bones or anything, but we're going to look at these actions and what's going on. Okay, so I've zoomed back out. We're going to look at BD turn and BD face in just a second, but let me show you what I'm going to do to set up these bones to make things visible and easy to understand. So I'm going to go to the bone layer, and I'm going to select all the bones that are in this view, and I'm going to go Bone, Hide Selected Bones. So now they're just kind of not in the way because I'm not really focusing on the bones. I don't want them to kind of get in my way of things. I'm going to now go to the dress, and we're going to click on BD Turn. And as I do that, I move the cursor, and you can see that what's happening with BD Turn is that Shakawa is going from the three-quarter view where she faces to the left, and this is the front part of her chest. As we move to frame 50, she turns away from our view so that now her back is to us. And BD Face is where she's going from that three-quarter turn to where she's facing us. And that happens in 25 frames. It doesn't matter whether it's 25 or 50 or whatever, but in this particular case it happens to be 25. And so that's what those two actions are doing. Now to see even a little bit more of what's happening here, I'm going to make sure I've got the Select Points tool selected, and I'm going to go ahead and turn off the back bow, and I'm going to turn off the polka dots, and I'm actually even going to turn off the dress so that you can only see the points. And so as we can go back to BD Turn, and we'll see what happens there. And BD Turn, we see that the dress is fairly simple. There is a fringe edge there, but what happens is I move from here to frame 50, we're moving certain points. And so there's really only two keyframes. This one keyframe is the intermediate position, and then the final position where she's facing away. And so all that is done is that it goes, the shape, this shape of the dress is just changing slightly. Now notice he's not moving points all over the place. It's just the outline that's changing. Now if I keep the polka dots off and I keep the bow off, notice that we see the dress kind of shifting, and if you happen to be very good at animation, you may know that she's turning three-quarters, but especially if I look at the bottom, it's maybe not so obvious. But notice that the shoulders give us that appearance. We see the shoulders changing a little bit, but notice how the dress is designed so that there is this little V in the back, and that V helps us with our visual understanding of what's happening with this dress, that it's really turning around as opposed to just moving some way. And it's the polka dots and the back bow. As we put that back bow, notice that that's a visual cue for us, so that makes it easy for us to see what's happening. Now, same thing with the polka dots. Those polka dots, the main value of that is that it's giving us that ability to see that turning of the dress. Now, to help us see the importance of some of these visual cues, let me now take this same view, and I'm just going to move Shakawa up a little bit so that you can't see this this V kind of area in the dress. Move that up a little bit, and I'm going to turn off the visibility of the other layers and just highlight the dress so that you can just see the points. But you'll notice with that, if I don't have these visual cues, and you can kind of see that node coming down a little bit here, so let me move it up a little bit more even. If I don't have that, it looks like the dress is just kind of wiggling as opposed to turning. So the visual cues, so this is one of the points about the animation, is that the visual cues design your clothes and your characters such that you can have these simple visual cues about what's going on. Now there's one other point that I want to show. Let me get back to this bow again. You may have seen this as you were looking. As I move Shakawa around, notice that the bow goes behind the dress and in front of the dress, and you look over here, you can see that happening. And so because these layers are switching order, that's actually done in a keyframe at the bone layer, and we can see that right here, this layer ordering. And so right there is where the bow comes in front on frame 12 in front of the dress. Okay, Now let's look at the polka dots, because the polka dots are quite interesting. Let me go ahead and turn off the back bow so it doesn't get in the way, because we're going to focus on the polka dots. And let me now click on the polka dots, and you'll go, whoop, what are all these? If you're not familiar with masking, you may be going, what are all these things going on? And these polka dots, and then there's this thing that kind of looks like a tongue or something. Well, that's the shading. And as we can see, basically the polka dots are just moving left to right, or excuse me, right to left as I scrub the cursor. And that's just giving us that motion as we see. Now, this tongue-looking kind of thing actually becomes more apparent what it's used for if I double-click on BD Face, which is just the turning in the other direction, and you can see it is kind of like that V in the back of the dress. It helps us see that she's facing towards us because of the shading. It's a kind of a shading effect. So the main point that I'd like to express about this is that this is not a lot of complicated point moving or anything. They're just moving it fairly simply, and this tongue, in fact, thing is just changing just a little bit, moving a couple of points. It's only a couple of points. Now, it looks as you look at these dots, these polka dots, all of them are moving independently, but you could have just taken all of them and moved them as a group and tweet. So I'm not exactly sure how he was doing it when he actually did that, but you can, select certain points and manipulate them. So it's all about the point movement to make it look like her body is turning. Okay, so now I'm going to turn off the, or go back out to the main line action, because we don't really need to look at those actions when we're going to talk about masking. That's what I want to show now. Now, one thing that you can know is with the display quality, you can turn off masking, and by doing that, in the editing, while I'm editing, I can actually see those polka dots and what happens as things turn. But let's talk about how masking is working. So I'm going to go to the layer 8 to the dress. Now, unfortunately, this this dialog is a little bit too large to show in 1280 by 1720, so I'm just going to have to move it up a little bit here, and I'm going to go to the masking area. And notice that what you do for the dress is you do hide all, and so anything that's outside of the mask will be hidden. And we go to the polka dots, and that layer is masked. So what's going to happen is the lowest layer, the dress, is actually going to be the mask, and the polka dots are going to be the things that are masked. Now let's go to the dress layer, and you'll see that it's add to mask. So this is the only layer that's part of the mask, and it will be the thing that determines what gets erased, if you will. And we exclude the strokes. And so what happens is, when we have masking, these polka dots that are outside, the dress is actually forming the mask, the dress itself. And anything outside of that on these other layers are going to be masked. So let me go back here and turn on masking. And we see that if it falls outside of the dress, then it is not rendered. Now, one other quick point, you may notice that there are a couple of point keyframes here for the polka dot layer in the actual main line. They're not really needed. They make a slight change to the thing, so you can affect them however you want, but it was just a tweak. So, he wants those to line up, and so you could have done that in the action, or you could, this is a good point, is that you may create bone actions that in the animation they need to be tweaked a little bit, and so that's what's happening here, is there's just a little bit of a tweak to those so that those polka dots all line up toward the middle. That's what's happening. And probably part of that was so that during the turn, it aligns. Now notice here we'll see some turning, and so we're going to talk about that next. Okay, so now we want to talk about we've talked about the BD turn, which is Shakawa turning away from us, and that's at the very beginning, turning away. Let me make sure I have that back bow on again so it shows that turn. So the BD is turning away, and the BD face turns toward, but how do we turn that into a 360-degree turn? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to flip some layers. And to show that easily, what I'm going to do, I'm going to go back to frame 0, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up my tools, window tools, and I'm going to select bones, and I'm going to select certain bones, and then select bone, hide selected bones, and I'm just going to select all of them except for that main root bone or that's at the hip, so that you can see obviously it's pointing to the right now. Now notice what will happen is it will flip and point in the other direction, and it's going to flip several times as she's going around and around. That's what's happening. So there's layer flipping going on, and so we'll show you that. That's actually in this channel. But I'll show you another thing that if you work with anime or with Moho, you want to know how to do this, which is underneath view timeline channels, so that you can turn off different channels or show different channels. So I'm going to go none, and then I'm going to select only this channel here, the layer transformation where we're flipping. And so I'm going to do apply. And so all I'm interested in looking at right now is that one channel where the layer is being flipped. Now notice that we've got some layer flipping going on in some of the other places or whatever. You can see that the channel is showing up, but the layer is actually flipping at the bone layer. And so let's take a look at that, and let me close these tools down, and I can click for zoom in so that we can see this a little bit easier. Okay, so I've made a little bit of a change just so that it's easier to see some things. I've set the BD face bone to be orange. To do that, you just select the bone, and then the color you can select to whatever color that you want. And then I've made the channels so that the blue bone angle, orange bone angle, and the layer horizontal flip, those are the only channels that are showing up. And that's just so that it's easier to see what's going on. So what happens is, starting at the very beginning, the BD turn bone is turning Shakawa away from the camera. And then right when we're essentially fully turned away, the next keyframe, on frame 10, we flip the bone layer horizontally. Now, an important point to know on all flipping, whenever you do layer flipping, you want to make sure that there's not a big difference in the shapes, so that there's a big jarring type of appearance. So since Shakawa is facing straight up and down, there's no big jarring appearance. It looks very similar in those two frames when you flip that layer. So now, just as we've turned turn that bone down, now the bone will come back up. And as it comes back up, we get to this place, and then right here, right when it's almost fully up, the BD face bone is going to start moving down. So when she has moved from facing away to a 3/4, now she's going to start turning towards us. So there's a little bit of tweaking here in these bones, but in general what's happening is one bone is operating and then the other bone is operating. A little bit of difference there, but that's what's happening. So here the BD face is the predominant bone working, and it's being turned. She's turning to face us, and then right when she's essentially facing straight towards us, we again flip the layer, and that's on frame 21. So again, we make sure that there's not a big difference in the shapes, the silhouette of the character. So now, again, the BD face bone will start turning up, and you can see it comes back up. So the BD turn bone goes down, we flip, the beady turn bone comes up, then the beady face turn bone goes down, we flip, and then the beady face comes up. And that's how you get the 360-degree turn. Okay, so let's go back to the very end of the cycle and notice that she does this after the turning. She does some body wave, if you will. And so how is that done? So again, looking back at just the dress, we see that this cycle goes on, and there's no keyframes for the bone layer, no keyframes in between the time where she is completed the first cycle, and now the cycle just continues and continues until we get to frame 120. And at frame 120, we just freeze the pose, and then now we just are moving the bones in the body. So I'm not showing the arms or the head or any of these other things, but you can just see that there's just movement of the body, and he even is translating the bone here, so it's not just staying connected, just anything to get this body here to look the way he wants it to look. And so just moving things around to give that appearance. And so the very fact that we add this keyframe, it stops the cycle. That's the main point. And then from that point, you're just animating the character as you normally would. So the last point here, when we see this transformation of the bone, don't think that you just have to only use the standard type of bone manipulation tool like this. You can transform the bone however you want. You can move it wherever you want to get whatever position that you want or shape that you like. So that's it for the tutorial on Shakawa on the dress turning, and I hope that was helpful. Hope you learned a little bit about moho from that, and learn how to make your characters more alive. And I'll try to create some other videos to understand a little bit more about Shakawa. It's a great character, and Egyptian Boy did a great job creating that and sharing it with us, and we really appreciate that. Thanks. Bye-bye.